welcome to another episode of Modern Cyber. I am thrilled today to be joined by somebody that I've known for a little bit while and I've spoken to in the past, and you've probably heard me speak to in the past, but he's somebody who brings a ton of insight and experience to the space. I'm joined by Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson is a former CISO at multiple Fortune 100 companies, Fannie Mae, JP Morgan Chase Corporate Investment Bank, and GE Treasury included. And he's currently a managing partner at Delve Risk, a market research firm focused on cybersecurity and innovative technologies. He's a sitting board member of multiple companies, a mentor and coach to multiple Fortune 500 CISOs, and an active advisor and investor to a number of cybersecurity startups. He holds a BS in Computer Information Systems from Regis University, an MBA from Indiana University, and I can honestly say from my own experience, one of the nicest people I've ever met in my career. Anthony, it is a pleasure to have you back on. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's always a great time to chat with you, man.
Awesome. So we're here in early 2024, and I'm really curious, as somebody who's been a CISO and now kind of transitioned out of that, how do you look at the state of the CISO right now and what you're probably hearing from, peers and colleagues that you've known in the past? Because it feels like there's a little bit of a shift going on where, somebody described it to me as the Sarbanes-Oxley moment of cybersecurity, where personal accountability is starting to come into play. Like, what are you hearing from people on the ground? How are they feeling about being CISOs right now?
So I've said this in the past, and someday it's going to bite me, but I'll say it again. There's a difference between what I call a little C and a big C when it comes to being a CISO. And specifically, a lot of the big C CISOs, which isn't necessarily just driven by organizational size, but it's really by their level of accountability, actual authority within an organization, like the scope and breadth. Are they truly an executive, or are they, a security manager, right? The big C's are actually really concerned about this, because part of the challenge is that you have general counsels, you have the rest of the executive teams who are, in a lot of cases, not taking this personal liability conversation seriously. It's like, no, you're covered. Don't worry about it. We don't need to have a special call out. And they're like, well, am I a named exec? No, I'm not a named exec. Am I covered on that policy? Yes. But what you're seeing is, for example, there's a security leader who's going through something right now, very public.
Yep.
He's protected if he's found innocent. But if he's found guilty, he owes all that legal debt for his defense, right? And so that's a really interesting piece of where you have a security leader who's like, hey, I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm following the guidance. And all of a sudden it's, well, if the courts find you innocent, we'll cover your 7-figure legal debt. If they don't, you owe it. And I think that security leaders, particularly the big C, are like, hey, you know what? I need some additional protection. I need some, I have to have my own level of insurance here? What does that mean?
Yeah.
Whereas the little C's, they're not even comfortable having that conversation yet.
And where would you draw the line? Like, what defines a little C in this world? Is this somebody where, they're chief in name only, but they probably report to a general counsel or report to a CFO, as I've seen in a number of organizational structures?
Absolutely, they could. And you could still be a big C and report to CIO, right? To be clear, it really comes down to whether the rest of that executive team thinks that or views you as actually having a meaningful spot at the table, right?
Yeah.
If you're just the guy that or gal that goes and, hey, lock up the doors and windows, versus, hey, help us to have a more efficient flow of things, and you're part of the actual business solutioning here.
Yeah. And I mean, it does bring to mind, especially what you just said about, let's say things like having an insurance policy, whether taking this role going forward is going to have that written into employment agreements, right? And, whether there will be a market then of insurers who are willing to say, hey, business buys its own insurance, but you might need to buy a separate insurance policy or, negotiate into your contract that you get coverage or money to cover this.
100%. I actually believe that any CISO taking a role today needs to have their own insurance policy. And so I think they need to have their own insurance policy, or it needs to specifically be called out that they are covered across the board, right?
But what insurance policy would this be, right? Because like, I don't even know what, if I were taking this role on and I called up an insurance company, what am I asking for?
I think it would probably be something like an E&O, right? So the errors and emissions.
Yeah,
something like that, right? And I'm not an insurance broker or anything like that, right?
Full disclaimer,
Don't
even play it on
but
TV.
as I think about it, as a small business owner, I have my directors and officers, I have my E&O, right? I have my professional liability. It's going to be some amalgamation of that, where you're like, hey, I did the right thing. I tried to do the right thing. I didn't break any laws, but I knew it. Like, I followed guidance from counsel, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that, but we're in this murky time period where I've seen CISOs that are in the contract negotiation for their salary. They ask those questions, and the feedback that they get is like, yeah, we don't do that for you. It's like, wait a minute. I know N number of people that are being sued or on the hook or whatever that means here, right? It's a different world.
And to some extent, I even wonder whether, like, if I looked at it as an E&O kind of policy, errors and omissions, one case in particular that comes to mind that is, being played out right now pretty publicly, I would say that a lot of the evidence and a lot of the analysis I've read leads me to think that this was a nation state directed or funded, research to figure out the vulnerabilities and the chaining of vulnerabilities, because it's a pretty sophisticated exploit. And by the way, just to plug for a second, APIs were a key component in there, and it's something that a lot of firms aren't looking at right now. Check us out if you want to learn more about that space. But what error or omission could you realistically point to that then an insurer wouldn't say, like, yeah, look, that's not covered?
And that's where, and I don't know, right? I do think that there's an aspect of where you're going to have, I think that security leaders do have to have their own representation on this, right? I could see, and I think there's a number of different ways that you could see this kind of forming. It might be like a brainstorm idea. Someone wants to go build a company of like, hey, it's going to be a co-insurance of a bunch of security leaders who, self do something like there's got to be a way, because otherwise the liability and potential risk isn't worth it, right? And especially it's not worth it when you have a bunch of CISOs who are still making, a couple $100,000, and all of a sudden they can be on the hook for a few $1 million in legal fees because their CEO did something.
Or whether CEO, CFO, or someone else did something that didn't allocate the budget necessary 100%. To protect the organization. And I hear that complaint and concern a lot. And it might be that, it might be didn't get the budget, or it might be didn't get the organizational mandate, where, let's say, the CISO came in and assessed that the organization had a particular attack surface that wasn't covered and needed that coverage, but then business stepped in and said, nah, you can't put that coverage in place because it's the risk of blocking legitimate transactions, et cetera, it is too high.
Exactly. And then what you get into is you get security leaders who are actually incentivized to over dramatize how bad it is, so that they're not the ones who said no, right? Because they're like, oh no, I tried to make the case that it was so bad, and they told me no, so it couldn't have been my liability. It was clearly the business's liability, right? And so it disconnects this actual aspect of the security leader having a meaningful say. And you want them to have a meaningful say. You want them to be able to advocate for the right amount of security.
Right. And that right amount of security is always like, that's the one where I kind of hate the answer, it depends, right? But it is that classic example of what is the right amount of security. Well, it does very much depend on the organization, on prioritization, on the level of risk tolerance, on the level of, could be insurance coverage, could be the criticality of the data, regulatory compliance scope. All of those things factor into what is the quote unquote right level of security.
That's exactly the quote I like to. It's one of my favorite quotes. Steve Jobs, where he's like, you can't connect the dots looking forward, right? You can only connect the dots looking back. And he's talking about life and career and all this stuff. But when it comes to like the right amount of security, the right amount of parenting or over parenting or whatever it is, you can only connect the dots looking back. You're like, ooh, maybe I was a little too protective on that, and I should have let
Yeah.
her fall and scrape her
Yeah.
knee because
Yeah.
she'd be riding a bike by now or whatever that is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that we run this risk of people, you know, Monday morning quarterbacking it and being like, well, you know, you probably should have done this. Like, I didn't know Russia and China were going to team up to do this thing and go after this thing that didn't exist.
Yeah.
And go after me specifically for that data set. Like,
and that is such a challenge, because when we see these kind of, let's say, you know, industry wide, I won't call them existential because that's not the right word, but these kind of like landmark occurrences, you know, some people would say like Black Swan, like SolarWinds, you know, this kind of like low and slow multiple year supply chain infiltration, or like last year, the exploiting a broadly distributed third party piece of software that's running on-prem for thousands of organizations worldwide through a very, very sophisticated exploit. Like, these are the first instances of those things, which in a way would say, like, looking back to connect the dots, pretty hard, like a pretty hard calculus to come up with that.
The example I'll use actually from this week is we saw that, was it Change Health, the event that's gone on there. What's really fascinating is that I think it was in December, November, FBI did a takedown of some attacker group website. The attacker group reclaimed their website and said, hey, because the FBI did this to us, gloves are off. We're going after critical infrastructure, including hospitals.
Yeah.
And now the risk dynamic for all these hospitals who weren't necessarily concerned about this particular threat actor is like, oh my gosh, we are in the crosshairs directly of these people who are mad at a government agency or whatever, and we're feeling the brunt of it, right? Companies get attacked not just because they did something bad, but it could be because you're based there. This is the country or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I remember years ago, I was living in Southeast Asia, and there was a set of political decisions made by the U.S. administration that were viewed as being very anti-Muslim, and there was a boycott of Starbucks in Indonesia. And it's this kind of, you know, knock-on effect of something that you may not have been connected to in the first place. So
100%, right? Yeah. And the real scary part, though, is I call it the high wall problem, which is that it's something like 50% of U.S. GDP is actually the SMB, the small to medium businesses, right?
Yeah.
In large enterprises, which is where my background is, we have millions and hundreds of millions and billions of dollars to spend on cybersecurity and talent and tech and all this stuff and recovery. And the SMB doesn't.
Yeah.
Right? And it doesn't take a highly trained nation state actor to get mad at somebody who owns N set of restaurants because they are part of the city of Chicago or whatever it is, right? Like, and so the fallout is that you have these big companies with very high walls, well-trained defenders protecting, you know, their enclave, and outside of the high walls becomes a scorched earth.
Yeah.
Right. And the SMBs are the ones who have to rebuild and try to, you know, like Mad Max style, like, how do I cobble along, which is such a huge part of our U.S. economy.
Yeah. And this point in particular really hits close to home. I mean, not only because I'm also an SMB, but, you know, I talk to a number of SMB owners on a regular basis. And even those that are outside the cybersecurity space, the little bubble that we, you know, spend most of our time in, you talk to them and you start hearing from them like, oh yeah, you know, we're hearing about this attack targeting restaurants or targeting, you know, doctors' offices, small dental practices, and so on. And, you know, the point that an adage that I go back to a lot is that hackers have automation too. And it's not necessarily that you're being targeted. It's that, like, it's just a spray and pray, broadly speaking, using automation across, you know, every IP address that they can find. And if you happen to have any internet exposure, you know, I think these organizations are just waking up to the fact that everybody's a target when automation is in play.
That's exactly it. That's why I use the high wall analogy, right? If you have an attacker out there with a flamethrower, they're just trying to hit whatever they can on the wall.
Right.
maybe burn something, get on the other side. But there's a lot of people and businesses between that attacker and that wall that are just going to be collateral damage, and they'll take their money and do the thing along the way. So we as a nation, as an industry, have to figure out how we shore up, which is one of the aspects of like building security and by design, right? Having secure and safe APIs, like having solutions that are that lead themselves to be safe for the SMBs to use, because they're not going to be able to go spend the $5 million to buy the N number of products.
Yeah, and I mean, this is why I think the development of managed security for SMBs is a net positive. I can't speak to the effectiveness of any particular vendor in the space, but I just think the growth of that type of offering, and hopefully they do a good job for their customers, is a net positive, because most of those SMBs, take the budget question out for a second, they're not going to have the expertise
100%.
To implement things. So.
They're not going to. And it's really interesting. If you think back like 20 some years ago, if you started a company, you might have a Yahoo as your email. You might have, Google, you might have Hotmail. Like you would have businesses that have all sorts of crazy email addresses. And today, if you start a company, it's going to be a Google or Microsoft.
Or Microsoft. Yep.
Right. And because I think there's been that consolidation of that. Same with building a server.
Yeah.
GCP, Azure, or AWS. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that the security stack needs to go in the same vein, to where a consumer I buy option 1, 2, or 3.
Right.
And I'm generally pretty good.
Well, that actually leads me to, it's a great segue to the next topic I wanted to discuss with you. Cybersecurity is a space that new threats emerge, new companies emerge to try to address those threats. And then what we tend to see is over a couple year cycle, we'll start to see consolidation into that space. And in the last couple of years, it seems like that consolidation has started to accelerate. And, I've heard arguments and counter arguments for, quote unquote, best in breed versus best of suite, where, the trade-offs are kind of like, I could buy one platform that incorporates all of this functionality into it, but, there might be one particular attack surface where it's not the best. It doesn't have the best functionality, because there's this other company over here that only does data security, API security, cloud security, whatever it is. And they're super, super deep expert focused only on that. So how did you think about that kind of trade-off? And then also, how do you view the kind of like the macro trend of consolidation in the cybersecurity space from the functionality perspective?
Yeah. So this is always a fun topic, because one, this is actually, as business leaders, this is a problem of our own design, in that we are ADD and neurotic. Like when you could have a good suite of products, and then when a thing happens, everybody points to, oh my gosh, they didn't have the number one widget defense 42. So now everyone goes chases that, and they spend a bunch of money there, right? I personally have always taken the view, I'm more interested in the most integrated solution as opposed to the most innovative solution.
Okay.
I think innovation is brilliant. I love it. But the problem that we have, and we have this in large enterprises particularly, is you actually have way too many tools that you're not doing anything with. Right?
Yeah.
You put them in. One of my favorite conversations I have with vendors is, our customers, is they're like, well, how do we get the so-and-so head of vuln management or security operations or CISO to log into the portal or our platform? And I'm like, they're not.
It's not the right question.
And I was actually at a dinner a few weeks ago where they were like, how do we get you guys security leaders? And I asked them, I was like, when was the last time you guys logged into a vendor platform? And across the board, they were like, it's been years, dude. I don't do that. Like it's just not happening here. So we have tools that are being installed, but not actually maintained, not actively being used. They're not being used to its full suite of capabilities. So we buy things that are, hey, it solves that hole. Okay, we plug this hole, and then someone comes back a couple years later, a new security leader is like, hey, consolidate this down. Like, because the vendors are also buying up each other. expanding their capabilities. And you look at one product today, it might be here, and in 3 years it might be here, and then you have an overlap, right? And so that's a big thing. And the one of the big driving factors, I'm not a Microsoft fanboy, right? But Microsoft security is bigger than what the next 20 cybersecurity vendors combined, right? It's a massive entity, and I think that that type of model of having one platform is going to be where things are. You have to go to more and more for that pure integration play.
And do you think that's mostly a function of we have a limited number of hours in the day? We're not going to go log into all these tools. We're only, our waking and working hours are just going to be consumed by the alerts and events that do get triggered. And so, the other tools that we bought, we just don't have the time to go back to them? Or do you think it's a function of actually attacks are getting more sophisticated and the correlation of the data is so valuable that that's where we actually need to be?
So I actually, maybe, and this might be an oversimplification, it probably is. I'm a fan of Price's Law. Price's Law states that, you can take anything, take sales. 50% of the output is provided by the square root of the number of things delivering that. So if you have a sales team of 25, 50% of the sales is actually driven by 5 people on your sales team, right?
Okay.
And Price's Law holds true in general for most things. And I think it holds true for cyber, where let's take a vendor or take a company that has 100 products.
Yep.
There's 5 to 10 that actually do
delivering
50% of the value protection for that organization. And out of those 100 products, there's 5 to 10 that the security leader really knows or cares about, because by name recognition of like, oh yeah, that's doing the thing, right?
Yeah.
And when we add in 5, let's say 100 products, you got 10 that do 50%. That means you have 90 doing the other 50%.
Yeah.
And it's a much smaller value add for each slice.
But then let me make the counter argument and just hear your reaction to it. It's, but look, there's so many emerging attack vectors, emerging threats, et cetera. In cyber, cyber defense is about making sure that you don't have the one slip up, because, the attacker just needs to get it right once. We on the defense side have to get it right all the time. So these other 50 tools, or 90 tools rather, in this 100 portfolio of 100, like, they actually do provide value by being there and covering the things that you're not thinking about. Like, is there validity in that argument?
I think there's some validity in it, but look at most of the breaches.
Yeah.
Right. Most of the breaches are not this fancy, sexy dance of oh my gosh, how do they figure out how to get into that one thing? They were right the one time. Most of the breaches are something that were a fundamental flaw. Somebody did something dumb. It was a misconfiguration of something here, right?
Yeah.
And I think my position on it would change a little more dramatically if it was like, wow, that's a pretty clever way that they did that. And I'm surprised they should have had end product to do this. Now, I do think with aspects of like the reliance of two pieces. One, mobile and APIs, like the amount of tech and data that we really rely on those two spaces, we're just not paying attention to them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, and that's where I think you're going to see these attacks, these opportunities hit. And it's like, that was kind of a negligent piece. Because again, Price's Law takes the same thing of like, how many things are actually protecting mobile? How many things are protecting the API? Like, okay, well, if you don't have 0, the square root of 0 is 0, right?
0,
like,
or maybe undefined. I'm not sure.
Undefined, whatever the calculator says. Right?
It's been so long, right? Since BC calculus back in high school, but that's a great point, and I did want to kind of think about that or explore that topic with you. It's like, I worked in cloud security for a long time, right? And in the cloud security space, we saw breach after breach after breach. And to your point, it was pretty much always misconfiguration, somebody did something dumb, or both, right? But it took years for the market to kind of, let's say, wake up to that fact. And we saw dramatic acceleration in just, let's say, the amount of attention that the space received and the number of conversations that were generated about what we would have said as a security, company 3 years later than we expected. Do you find that that's like pretty typical over, let's say, over a 20-year cycle, that it kind of takes a few years of things being bad before it starts to resonate?
Yeah, I think so. There's this adage that we used to use. I want to say in like 2005. You probably remember it. It's the lion and the gazelle, right? People are like, hey, attackers are like lions, and all the companies are like gazelles, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want to be the head of the pack, because
Yeah.
then you're probably overspending. You don't want to be the
Right.
last, because you might get grabbed. So you want to be
Yeah.
kind of squarely in the middle, right?
Yeah.
Now, I think that with the speed of technology and how things like that has changed, but I do think that there is an aspect of where we businesses do wait to see some other gazelles fall before we're like, okay, I need to step it up a little bit more. I'm going to spend a little more calories to run a little faster, because the pace we were going is no longer acceptable.
Yeah. And one thing that's been interesting along those lines is, we see however many breaches we see, but they're happening every day, right? And, organizations of all sizes are getting breached. One of the more interesting observations from my own experience in the cyberspace is that it's pretty much never the company that got breached that is immediately reaching out to you to say, hey, we got breached on attack vector X that your company protects against. It's almost always competitor of organization that got breached reaching out, because to your point, they can see the other gazelle fall and think like, I don't want that to be me.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think that it's an interesting conversation. This is a great question. And I've, that I like to ask security leaders. And the answer, let me start with the answer, is that most of them feel that it is their fault, or they are the bigger risk. And who's they? If you ask a lot of security leaders, which is a bigger risk, actually getting hacked or the regulatory risk afterwards?
Yeah.
It's not actually the cost of the breach of restoring operations and getting the business back. It's the fear of fines and litigation and regulatory oversight that now starts to really dwarf how much a breach actually cost the company.
Yeah.
Right.
And you think that's worse than the loss of customer trust and the reputational damage?
How many new credit cards did you get in the last year? Like where you just got one because, hey, your company, it's more of a, like you get a new credit card because they're like, hey, your data was breached. Here's your new card. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think out of all of the breaches, and I did this math, like we looked at it, like, I think it was a year and a half ago.
Okay.
Only 2 companies didn't fully recover on the stock market within 9 months.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
And then exceed where they were at the time of the breach. Right.
Yeah.
If Target had another event, people are still going to go buy those Stanley mugs.
Yeah.
Right.
But I mean, one kind of counter argument that I'm wondering, right, and is are the fines just not big enough? Because I think like the reputational damage, et cetera, as you said, okay, great. Consumers get over that. They go back to shopping. They get a new credit card. Yeah, it's annoying to have to log into Netflix and update my credit card number, whatever. But I do it, right? And I just wonder if like the regulatory fines, they just aren't that big. I'll tell you, just on the API security side, there were 2 very parallel companies in different geographies who both had breaches. One in the US that had a breach 3 times larger than a company in the same space on the other side of the world. The breach was 1/3 the size. The fines were almost 0 in the US and about like over 200 million outside the US. And go ahead.
I think it's interesting. If when it comes to fines, I think that you see organizations, because again, you can look back and be like, well, you guys should have done that and you should have done this.
Yep.
Right. And so you end up with organizations being fined that at the time probably made a realistic or reasonable business decision.
Okay.
Right?
in terms of what they were willing to invest relative to the risk.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And it's hard to Monday morning quarterback, hey, should we have not built that new plant and instead bought these types of things? Or especially when so many of these threat actors are moonlighting at night, foreign state agents who have a clearance to go attack U.S. business interests, right? So really the question becomes like, how deep down the rabbit hole of victim blaming do we go? Because if I get mugged or my house gets broken into, and then I get fined because I didn't lock my door on the Sunday afternoon, like now it might be different if I didn't have locks and I didn't have a door, and then they're like, listen, you lost all your stuff because you didn't have doors, and it was whatever, right? I think there's a difference there.
No, I understand that difference, but I would also say that there's a difference on the perpetrator side, right? Because like on the perpetrator side, it's the job of your local police department to, potentially track down that thief and try to help you recover the stuff. And there are laws that specifically ban what they're doing. Cyberspace is not regulated that same way. Most of the perpetrators are overseas, and you don't have a law enforcement authority that is even credentialed or has the mandate to defend organizations. And this is like the one thing where I see this kind of
it is, dude. I actually haven't been able to use this analogy in a while, which is one of my favorites, right? So in the U.S. particularly, we are not responsible for our own security. We pay taxes. We have police. Except when it comes to cybersecurity, right? It's like, when it comes to cybersecurity, you're on your own, right? And the way I use this as a model, and I have an entire rubric made out, I call it Joey, Joe, Joseph, and Yosef. Okay. Joey is the equivalent of a 12-year-old kid who Googled some stuff on YouTube and figured out how to hack your company. Okay. If you get beat up by a Joey, you get hacked by a Joey, you are negligent, done, end of story. Joe is a 19, 20-year-old kid, college kid, some savviness, right? You get hit by a Joe, like you have a big corporate enterprise, you should be able to defend against a Joe. Joseph is going to be your 35, 40-year-old sysadmin who's been in your company for a while. Man, that's super tough, right? Because he knows your stuff. And Yosef is a nation state threat actor. We shouldn't be punishing organizations for getting hacked by a Yosef.
Yeah.
Right. It's tough to punish a company who got hacked by a Joseph, by somebody who built the tech and has worked there and understands the processes and has that backdoor key. But it's the other ones where you're like, I can see fines, especially a Joey.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's it's a great analogy. I really like it. Do you have this rubric published online anywhere?
I think I published it a few years ago. I'll dig it up and send it over to you. But yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, anyway, we'll have the video clip of this that we'll make available on LinkedIn or something for you. But I think that's a great analogy. Anthony, just a couple final thoughts to wrap up here. How do you feel about cybersecurity in 2024 going forward? Do you feel like we are, as an industry, making progress, backsliding, facing a kind of a moment of real tension and kind of coming to grips with the reality of the current situation? Like, what's your overall emotional feeling about the space right now?
So without getting into the whole AI world conversation too much, I think that there's a lot of new technology advances and expansions that are happening that security leaders aren't actively getting educated on. There's the growth rate of some of the innovations that are happening, how businesses are going to change dramatically. And I think a lot of security leaders are resting on the laurels of, I've been in tech for 30 years. I've seen it, not realizing like, well, the world is about to potentially really, really shift here. Yeah. I think that you are seeing new security leaders ask tough questions from vendors of like, hey, are you guys going to be here? Like, what does this look like? Yeah. What's your path to success? Right. Yeah. Because I think they're re-challenging this notion of the free flowing investment cycle that's happened for the last 5-6 years. And so I think those are fair, which makes it opportunistic for organizations like the large platform players to come in and be like, trust us. We've been here forever. We're going to be here forever longer. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that security leaders do need to have, get more engaged with vendors, especially startup organizations, to understand like, hey, what are you guys actually seeing? Like, how should we think about this? Because the problems that need to be solved are not the same ones we've had to solve.
Yeah, and I mean, this is such a great point. And obviously, I feel strongly about this as somebody who's created a company to try to go address an emerging risk that, you mentioned earlier, mobile API, and those are just two of them, but there's 10, 20, 30 emerging threats that people aren't necessarily getting educated on.
It's fascinating, right? Especially when you talk to somebody and you start to talk about API security, and then you realize they don't actually understand the conversation, and you're like, oh, okay, how do I educate you without insulting you? But you got to get there together, because this is so critical to the future of industry, your company, our country.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we're pretty much out of time, and I think that's a great place to leave today's conversation. We will definitely have to pick up another thread another time. Anthony, I always learn so much from talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the podcast today.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure.
Awesome. And for people who want to find out more about Anthony, the work that they're doing over at DelveRisk, it's just delverisk.com, DELVE risk.com. You can also find Anthony on LinkedIn. He is one of the most prolific posters of good quality, valuable content, I will say, out there. So do look him up. And thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Jeremy.